Thank you very much. I would like to thank Mr. Pascal Camberdi for inviting me here. It is a pleasure to be with you here. I hope there will be enough light bulb moments for you, as I noticed. I envy you in the sense that I would have liked to spend also a week like this in this wonderful environment and learn about what you are learning about in the context of this wonderful place. What I would like to do is first say how I would like to organize this lecture, and then I have a few points to make before I speak more specifically about the Moroccan case. First, so as I talked to Pascal, I will give a sort of part of. We are supposed to meet for 3 hours, so half of this will be me providing you with different ideas and what I have to say about Morocco, and the other half will be open to questions and debates and criticisms of what I said. But the fact that the first part is a sort of lecture does not mean that you cannot stop me when something is not clear. You can, or when you have a question about the point that I raised. So I don't want to make this too rigid, okay? So that we make it useful for you. And okay, I have 5 points. 4 points to make before I actually deal more specifically with the Moroccan case. One is a philosophical point, and the second point, I will speak in a very short way about what happened in Morocco, and then I will introduce you in the third about some key concepts, theoretical concepts, in order to understand the Moroccan case. And in the fourth point, I will speak about what makes Morocco different. And then at the end, fifth part of your lecture will be mainly concentrating on Morocco and more specific details about the short side, as I said. So I will say short, but then I will elaborate. Okay? So let me start with the philosophical point of view. And in the light of what is happening, what has been happening in different parts of the Arab world, you can call it the Arab Spring, you can call it the Arab Uprising, you can call it whatever you call it, but there is clearly a dynamic for change. And for me, this dynamic for change is suggestive and revealing from a philosophical point of view about the fact that in the end, people, regardless of their cultural differences, regardless of their religious background, regardless of their ethnic background, people like to live with dignity, they like freedom, they like to work and eat, and this is something that is common to most of us. So this is in itself very important for me because during the height of the, for example, the Arab Uprising, we found images that sort of counters the kind of images that we are familiar with when we speak about Islam. We see women with veil that is standing in front of thousands of people speaking about the necessity for democratic change. This is many images in Yemen about this. We see women next to man in the streets of Tahrir in Egypt. And these are all images that generally challenge the stereotypical view of images that we normally have in mainstream in mainstream media, whether in the United States or in Europe. And for me, this is in itself speaks about a dimension of humanity from a philosophical point of view, and that we need to really keep in mind. Why I am speaking about this? Well, because for many, many years, very often when when we spoke about democracy in the Middle East, very often the Arab world was referred to as the exception. So this is how it is. When political scientists, whether in the United States or Europe or even in the Middle East, spoke about the Middle East, they called it the Arab exception. And what they meant by that, the Arab exception, is the fact that, well, these people, you know, because of their religion, because of Islam, you know, democracy has not taken place. So the famous idea of the third wave, okay, was in reference to what has been happening in Eastern Europe, as Samuel Huntington speaks about it. The third wave is a reference to the kind of democratization processes that were taking place in Eastern Europe and then in parts in Latin America and even in some parts of Africa. But when it came to the Arab world, they referred to it as the exception. And for me, what has been happening in different parts of the Arab world is clearly a challenge to this notion of exception. And for me, this is something very important. Why? Because for many years, there was a kind of culturalist, okay, what I would call culturalist approach to the study of Middle Eastern politics. What do I mean by culturalist approach? Very often, when we speak about the what is clearly a lack and a complete inexistent democratic system, when we spoke about that, very often we tended to think about it in a culturalist sense. Okay? Otherwise, we start asking questions, for example, is Islam compatible with democracy? For me, the very idea of asking and putting this question itself reveals a kind of culturalist approach that we are dealing with. And of course, one should ask this kind of question. I'm not suggesting that we should not. But when we fixate, we have what I would call fixation on culture as a way of explaining what is predominantly political phenomenon. Okay? Otherwise, for me, the obstacle to democracy has been not culture, but politics. This is what I feel. But very often, in the mass media, even among scholars, the issue about compatibility between Islam and democracy is often put at the forefront. Now, for me, this is in itself a problematic because it fixates, it's sort of fixation on the cultural approach. Let me give you a little story about Morocco that sort of will exemplify what I have been speaking about. Well, in about 2004, with a more liberal monarch, Morocco has engaged in legal reforms. This is what is known as the Mudawwana. In Arabic.
Sorry to interrupt you to translate in science that you would need to speak.
Mudawwana literally.
I'll check it.
Mudawwana is basically the legal codes that are applied in Morocco. Okay? So, and more specifically, legal codes that have to do with gender issues with women. Okay? So, in 2004, there was a process of reforming the Mudawwana in order to give more rights for women. Okay? And of course, it required, it is true, a more liberal monarch to do this. But for many, many, many years, since independence, yes, whenever people and women's movement and a lot of feminists were talking about the necessity to reform the Mudawwana, what was often the reaction? no, this is Islam, this is sacrosanct, it is against Islam, you see, and we cannot do that. It required 2004, and it required a political will, yes? This is politics, to say, no, I think we need to reform, because under the old king, clearly they did not do that. Okay? So here is something that is clearly a good example of the fact that something that we think it's Islam, no, we cannot change because this is ultimately started, and it's true, later on, a year later, there was a reform of the Mudawana with more rights. Of course, it's still problematic in terms of applying some of the new codes, but it is at least what the new reform have done away with this idea of that it is sacred, we cannot change it. Okay? So the point is that it required a political will to do that. Okay? And this is something for me very important. Well, if you want to apply this in a general sense to the Arab Middle East, and if you want to apply it to the notions of democracy, okay? Well, for many authoritarian regimes and authoritarian leaders, they have often exploited this culturalist argument in order to postpone the democratic project. Okay? So you would hear Mubarak say, well, if we democratize, we will end up with radical Islamic movement taking over, yes? Or, well, this is counter to our cultural characteristics and things. So I think, for me, if there is anything that at least for what happened in the Arab Spring, it has the Arab Spring in many ways has started to do away with this purely culturalist approach. Of course, people who know the Middle East have often been speaking about these issues, okay? But it sort of now became more at the popular level within popular discourse, and I think some of the images are very important in terms of breaking this culturalist approach. So in this sense, I think in order to understand the deficit of democracy in the Middle East, we need to go beyond culture. Well, we might speak of culture, but honestly, the only culture that has postponed democracy in the Middle East is the culture of fear. Otherwise, people were fearful because of their life, losing their lives. So that's, for me, it's a culture that I can agree with, the culture of fear, because people were afraid. But as we witness what has been happening in Syria, as one Syrian has put it, the bullets have killed the culture of fear, and the people are in the street. So if Saddam Hussein, if Bashar thinks that he's killing people, well, for many Syrians he has killed only the culture of fear, and this is why people are in the street. Anyway, I wanted to say these points about, at least from a philosophical and intellectual perspective. Now, let me move to the second point about Morocco and what happened in Morocco. Well, Morocco, as opposed to a number of other case scenarios, Morocco has gone through constitutional reforms, and in 2011, as opposed to the bullets of Bashar or Gaddafi, we had a constitution that was voted by the people, and in which a number of different political actors sort of presented some of their points, and in the end, we end up with a new constitution. Of course, there was a movement that was called the February 20th movement. That sort of triggered the push, and it sort of put more pressure on the regime in order to engage with constitutional reform. And I will speak more specifically about this. I'm just trying to put you on the same ground before I move to speak about details. And I'm also giving you a rosy picture before I become very critical. Okay? In Morocco, we have gone through these processes of changes. Because of that, Morocco starts to be seen as, well, this is wonderful. Morocco is going through, as opposed to what is happening in Libya and Syria, and to a certain extent in Egypt. Morocco is intelligent. The Moroccan regime is more intelligent, and so quickly Morocco starts to be seen potentially as a model for other Arab regimes, more specifically for a number of Arab monarchies. But it is exactly this idea of model that I will be very critical of. And I will be very critical of the procedures and the whole outcome of the constitution, as we shall see in the last section of this talk. Okay? But clearly Morocco does have a more a positive image vis-à-vis outside and external observers. Now, the fact that I am going to be critical does not mean that I am pessimist, okay? But I have to be just critical as somebody with relatively progressive views, okay? And I don't mind showing my politics, okay? So, this is the second point that I wanted to share with you. Now, the third point relates to what Morocco is about. So, and in this section, I would like to speak about a number of different concepts. Some of them are specific to Morocco, and some of them can be generalized. But I thought these concepts might help you think about the Moroccan context. Okay? If there is any concept, or before I speak about this, by the way, the fact that Morocco has gone through these constitutional reforms is very often used by the Moroccan officials and the Moroccan state as they started calling it Moroccan exceptionalism. We are exceptional. And we are not the kind of violent, so in fact they have capitalized in it, even though this idea of Moroccan exceptionalism is often ideologically constructed and politically instrumentalized, okay, for the benefit of Moroccan and Moroccan image and for strategic reasons in different ways. So there is this idea of Moroccan exceptionalism, and clearly here I will very much challenge this notion of Moroccan exceptionalism. Okay? So in fact, this Moroccan exceptionalism is not something that has to do only with the recent Arab Spring. For many, many years, Moroccan regime used to say that we do not have radical Islamism, yes, because our political system, the head of the political system, who is the king, is known as Amir al-Mu'minin, which is term number 3. Mu'minin, which is literally the commander of the faithful. Amir al-Mu'minin. And in order to, for you, maybe just as a memory, al-Mu'minin in Arabic. Okay? So, what is Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful? Well, for many years, for example, the Moroccan regime used to say, well, we don't have problem with radical Islamists because the head of the state, who is the king, has this symbolic religious title. Hence, he can control the religious field and do away with radicalism. Okay? But it was again ideologically constructed because we did have seen a rise of radical Islamism to a certain extent And we did have some of the suicide bombers that took place in May 16, 2003, that killed a number of Moroccans in Casablanca and in other parts. Okay? But anyway, part of this ideology of Moroccan exceptionalism also had to do, this is partly this, okay, one aspect that's sort of, that is constructed by the Moroccan state. So far, are you following me? Yes.
I didn't understand exactly the role of Amir.
And then what we need so the head of the state, who is the king, has a number of different titles. He is the head of the military, he is the head of many different institutions, and he has this religious title, which is the commander of the faithful, as somebody who, for example, safeguards the religious conditions and he guarantees that everything is under control. Okay? And it's of course also part of the legitimation of his position. Okay, it's part of so the political system. At least one aspect of the political system in Morocco is based on what is called the religious legitimacy. And this would give the ruler, the king, religious, sort of religious legitimacy. Okay? So,
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is Moroccan exception. A second important notion that is also essential to understanding the Moroccan context is definitely the notion of Makhzen. Makhzen. Okay? What is Makhzen? Well, as you may or may not know, but Morocco is now becoming one of the oldest monarchies in the world. Okay? It has this reigning monarchy, which is known as the Alawi dynasty. Has been in power since the 17th century. So forget about 30 years of Mubarak and the Alawi dynasty has been in power since the 17th century. And an important component of the Moroccan regime and the Moroccan monarchy became this notion of the Makhzen. The Makhzen, of course, it has over these centuries changed in terms of meanings. Initially, in fact, it was associated with Makhzen literally meant where you put products, agricultural product, where you hide agricultural product. Yeah? And of course, the monarchy, the monarchs, because of their money, they would put lots of agricultural products and distribute them. But then gradually, this phenomena, this notion took on a political meaning, otherwise where central authority and central power is concentrated. And today, the Makhzen refers to all the administrative apparatus and to the closest circle of the palace and the monarch. Okay? So, the closest circle of the palace and the monarch, as I will speak about it, are individuals that clearly have a very strong position because they are close to the king. Okay? So when people in Morocco speak about the Makhzen or Makhzen politics, they mean the very inner circle of the power that is supposed to be otherwise outside of the parties. Maybe this is the time to mention the fact that in Morocco, the fact that we have this long dynasty, yes, this historical dynasty, does not mean that it has not evolved. Morocco, since independence, because we were under the French, in 1956 it engaged in the creation of a multi-party system, okay, ranging from the left to the conservatives. In fact, today we have about 35 parties. And this is in itself, I will come back to this, but it's wonderful, huh? 35 parties, but in fact it is strategic for the regime, okay? But anyway, so in Morocco's political system is based on, if you will, on two different kinds of legitimacy. A religious legitimacy associated with the Amir al-Mu'minin, and quote-unquote democratic legitimacy, which is associated with the multi-party system, with a parliament, yes, with all sorts of different parties and things like that. And I will clarify about this because, in fact, this is in itself it is very important. It's very strategic for the regime. Okay, so the Makhzen. So today, progressive voices or the February 20th movement, when they are going in the streets, and they are still doing that today, even after the constitutional reform, one of their main targets is always the Makhzen, okay? But not the king, you see, and that's something that I will clarify also later, okay? Predominantly the Makhzen, which is the institutional and the... So, Makhzen is a notion that I think is very essential to understanding modern politics and historical politics in Morocco as well, okay? Now, when thinking about Morocco and the Moroccan's political system, well, if you read the 1996 constitution or the new constitution, Morocco is referred to as a parliamentary monarchy, or so otherwise a monarchy that is that has a parliament. But it's clearly very different from the system that might be associated with England or Spain, for example. Okay, because even though there is reference to parliamentary monarchy, in fact, the king has the main power, the executive power. And not only that, he concentrates power, and I will come back to this. But very often there is, when we speak about Morocco, it's parliamentary monarchy, but it's clearly very different from other parliamentary monarchies. I think, and I will start now my criticism, I think a better way of characterizing the Moroccan political system is to refer to it as liberalized autocracies, as in fact as it is used by Daniel Brunberg, who made use of this concept, Daniel Brunberg, liberalized autocracy, in the sense that it is one of those examples of monarchies that has engaged in more liberal politics and liberal economics, but the structures of power remain sort of in the hand of the monarch. Okay, historically, and here in Europe, very often people spoke of Enlightenment despotism. This was the notion that is referred to historically, but this is a sort of more modern concept of liberalized autocracies, and one would probably put Morocco, Jordan, and to a certain extent Emirates as part of this liberalized autocracy. Anyway, so I think this is something very important to keep in mind as thinking about Morocco, because it has been mentioned, the fact that we have recently, as a result, after the constitution, had an Islamist party that became, from which the prime minister has emerged, or the head of state, they call it now, the head of state with the new constitution. It doesn't make the same. It is different than if you have for example, what happened in Egypt. Yes, where the Muslim Brotherhood has gained. It is one thing for the Muslim Brotherhood to take power, and it's another for the PGD, the Party of Justice and Development. So the Islamist party that won is called the PGD, the Party of Justice and Development. Okay? So the fact that the Party of Justice and Development won, honestly, it's not the same weight as the Muslim Brotherhood winning in Egypt. Even though the Muslim Brotherhood have to confront the military, of course, yes, and they are constrained by it, but it's still, they have more weight than the PGD in the context of Morocco, and then we can speak more specifically about this. The point is that the PGD, the fact that the PGD came to power, honestly, even if the anarchists came to power or the communists, it wouldn't matter because constitutionally it is the monarch that has, and even in the new constitution, more so in the new constitution, it is the monarch who has, and the palace and the Makhzen who has everything